There is a doorway in rural France that has stood since the year 1423. It is 4 feet 11 inches tall. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly 4 feet 11 inches, measured and recorded. When researchers first encountered this structure in 1971, their initial assumption was straightforward. They believed it was a storage outbuilding, a place for tools, perhaps, or grain, something practical and small. It did not look like a space designed for human living. The entrance was too low. The proportions felt wrong by modern standards, so they labeled it accordingly and moved on. Then someone looked more carefully. It was a bedroom, not a storage room, not a utility space, not a cellar. A bedroom. The interior showed clear evidence of long-term human habitation. People had slept in that room. Families had lived behind that doorway. And not just briefly. Historical records connected to the property suggest the structure was in continuous residential use for close to 4 centuries. Generation after generation passed through that 4 foot 11 inch entrance as part of ordinary daily life. They did not consider it unusual. It was simply their door. Now, the first instinct when hearing this is easy to follow. Small door, small people. The logic feels immediate and obvious. If the doorway is that low, the people who used it must have been short enough to pass through it without difficulty. And if they were that short, the door makes perfect sense. Problem identified, problem explained. This is where most people stop thinking about it. But this is where it starts to get unclear. The family that built this structure was not recorded as unusually short. They were not an outlier community. They were not a family with any documented physical condition that would explain a dramatic reduction in height. According to the historical records available for this region and this period, they were average. Completely, unremarkably average for their time and their location. Which means that if this family was average, and they built a doorway that no modern adult can pass through without bending, then average people in 15th century rural France were apparently living in structures that would feel physically impossible to modern bodies. That raises a question that does not dissolve easily. Were people in the past genuinely that much smaller than we are today? And if they were, why? What caused that difference? And is the explanation that has been offered over the decades actually sufficient? The official answer does exist. It has been present in historical literature for a long time, repeated across textbooks, architectural guides, and general histories of medieval life. The explanation is essentially this. People before the modern era were shorter because they had harder lives. Poor nutrition, widespread disease, limited medicine, physical labor from childhood. All of these factors combined to produce smaller bodies. The low doorways are simply physical evidence of that reality. Builders built for the bodies they had. If the average person in a given century was 5 feet 3 inches tall, their door frames reflected that height. Nothing mysterious, just practical architecture responding to the physical reality of the population. At first, this explanation seems to close the question entirely. It is logical. It connects known biological facts about nutrition and growth to observable historical evidence, and parts of it are genuinely supported by research. Childhood malnutrition does affect adult height. Chronic disease during early development does reduce skeletal growth. These are not disputed points. The biology is solid, but there's a problem. The explanation assumes a relatively simple and continuous relationship between pre-modern hardship and reduced height. It implies that people were always shorter before modernity, and that the arrival of modern food systems, medicine, and sanitation gradually corrected this. A slow improvement, a steady climb. The story of progress bringing larger, healthier bodies over time. That is the framework the standard narrative operates within. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the actual physical evidence does not quite support that framework. Researchers who study ancient human remains, a field called bioarchaeology, have spent decades measuring skeletons recovered from burial sites across Western Europe. England, France, Germany, Scandinavia. Thousands of individual measurements compiled across multiple independent studies. And what those measurements consistently show is not what the standard narrative would predict. Men living in Western Europe around 100 AD averaged approximately 5 feet 8 inches in height. Women of the same period averaged between 5 feet 2 and 5 feet 4. These are not the measurements of a severely stunted population. These are numbers that would look entirely unremarkable on a modern street. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. If people in the early centuries of the first millennium were averaging close to 5 feet 8 inches, then the image of the pre-modern world as populated by small, physically diminished people is not accurate, at least not for that period. Those individuals, if dressed in modern clothing and placed in a modern environment, would not draw attention for their height. They were not dramatically shorter than people today. They were close, surprisingly close. So then what happened? Because the doorway in Burgundy was built in 1423, and it is 4 feet 11 inches tall. Something, between the early medieval period and the 15th century, clearly changed. The bodies got smaller. The skeletal record confirms it. Average male height in Western Europe dropped from around 5 feet 8 inches in earlier centuries to approximately 5 feet 5 by 1400, and continued falling in the centuries that followed. That is not a stable baseline of pre-modern shortness. That is a decline, a measurable, documented, multi-century decline in the physical size of ordinary people. This raises questions that the standard explanation does not fully answer. If the hardships of pre-modern life were the primary cause of reduced height, why were people taller in the earlier pre-modern period and shorter later? The pre-modern conditions of 100 AD were not dramatically more comfortable than those of 1400 AD. In many respects, they were arguably harder, and yet the bones from the earlier period show taller people. That inconsistency sits in the middle of the official explanation without being resolved. It does not fully make sense, and the timeline matters here. The Burgundy farmhouse was built at a specific moment in a specific region. 1423, rural France. That date does not sit in isolation. It falls within a period that historians of a completely different discipline, economic history, have documented extensively for entirely different reasons. It is a period during which the legal structure of land ownership and land access across Western Europe was undergoing significant transformation. Common land, land that had traditionally supported shared grazing, foraging, and small-scale animal husbandry for ordinary families, was beginning to shift into private ownership through a series of legal and political processes. The connection between that shift and the nutritional status of ordinary people has been studied, but it has rarely been connected to the physical evidence sitting in the buildings themselves. That connection is where this investigation is pointing, not toward a fully formed answer, not toward a single clear cause and a neat conclusion, but toward a gap, a space between what the official explanation offers and what the evidence, the bones, the buildings, the doorframes, the skeletal data from thousands of burial sites actually shows. The doorway in Burgundy is a physical object. It has a precise measurement, 4 feet 11 inches. It was built by people who were considered average for their time, and no adult of average modern height can pass through it without bending. That is not a curiosity. It is data, and data, when it does not match the explanation offered for it, deserves a closer look. There is something else worth noting about how this structure was interpreted when researchers first found it. The assumption that it was a storage building was immediate. It came before any detailed investigation of the interior. The doorway was low. Therefore, it was not a human dwelling. That assumption felt logical, but it was wrong. And it was wrong in a way that reveals something about how deeply the modern body has become the default reference point. When we encounter a space that does not fit our physical proportions, the first instinct is not to ask what kind of person fit there. The first instinct is to assume it was not made for a person at all. That instinct shapes how these structures have been described, documented, and understood for decades. The low ceilings, the narrow staircases, the compressed proportions of older rural architecture are routinely described in historical literature as primitive, as limitations of the era, as evidence of simpler and less developed construction. Rarely are they described as precisely calibrated to the bodies of the people who built and used them. And yet, that is exactly what they are. A builder constructs for the people who will live in the building. If the people are shorter, the building reflects that. The doorway in Burgundy is not a mistake. It is a measurement. Some researchers have begun treating these structures as exactly that, not as architectural curiosities, but as physical records. Data points embedded in limestone and timber that, when read carefully, tell a story about the bodies of the people who inhabited them. And when that story is read alongside the skeletal record and the economic history of the same period, the picture that emerges is more complicated than the standard explanation allows for. But complicated is not the same as resolved. The questions this evidence raises are genuine questions. They do not have simple answers. Some researchers emphasize disease. Some emphasize climate shifts. Some argue the land access explanation is overstated. Others believe it has been consistently underemphasized in ways that are not accidental. Each of these positions is supported by some evidence and challenged by other evidence. None of them fully closes the question. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: the doorway in Burgundy is 4 feet 11 inches tall. The people who built it were average for their time. The skeletal record shows that people in earlier centuries were measurably taller than people in the period when that doorway was constructed. The official explanation for this difference exists, but contains gaps that researchers have been pointing to for decades. And the physical structures of the past, the ones still standing, the ones being photographed and described as charming and atmospheric, are carrying information about the bodies of the people who built them that has not been fully read. That gap between the explanation and the evidence is not a minor discrepancy. It spans centuries. It is written into thousands of skeletons and hundreds of surviving buildings. And it begins, as many unresolved questions do, with something very simple: a doorway in France, a specific height, a family that was perfectly ordinary, and a question that the standard answer has not yet fully answered. Why were they that small? And more importantly, when did they stop being as tall as their ancestors had been? And what, exactly, changed when that happened? That is where this investigation begins. Not with a conclusion, with a measurement. When you walk through a museum dedicated to medieval life, or through the preserved rooms of an old rural farmhouse, the first thing most people notice is the ceiling. It is lower than expected. Not slightly lower. Noticeably, uncomfortably lower. A person of average modern height instinctively adjusts. The shoulders tighten. The head tilts forward slightly. There is a physical awareness of the space that does not happen in modern buildings. And the explanation offered on the information placard, by the tour guide, in the accompanying booklet, is always the same. People were shorter back then. That is why the rooms feel small. That is why the doorways are narrow. That is simply how things were. This explanation has been repeated so consistently, across so many sources, for so many generations, that it has stopped feeling like an explanation at all. It has become background fact, something absorbed rather than examined. People were shorter. Buildings reflected that. End of discussion. But it is worth slowing down and actually examining what this explanation is claiming, because an explanation repeated frequently is not the same as an explanation that has been fully tested. And when this particular explanation is placed next to the physical evidence that exists for human height across different historical periods, something does not quite fit together as neatly as the standard account suggests. The core of the official explanation rests on a familiar set of historical conditions. Before modern medicine, infections that are now trivially treated with basic antibiotics were potentially fatal. Before industrial food systems, the availability and variety of food was far more limited and far more dependent on local agricultural conditions. Before organized sanitation, waterborne disease was a constant presence in daily life, particularly in areas of dense settlement. The argument is that these conditions combined to produce bodies that were chronically stressed, undernourished, and physically diminished compared to what the same genetic populations would produce under better circumstances. Shorter people, weaker bones, lower average stature across the population. This reasoning is not invented. It connects to real biological mechanisms. The relationship between early childhood nutrition and adult height is well established. A child who receives inadequate protein and calories during the first 3 years of life will not reach their full genetic height potential. That shortfall is permanent. It cannot be corrected by better nutrition later in life. The window is specific, and the consequences of missing it are written into the skeleton for life. Similarly, repeated childhood illness places enormous metabolic demand on the body during critical growth periods. A child fighting chronic infection is diverting resources away from growth. The result, accumulated across a population over generations, is a measurable reduction in average height. So the biological logic behind the official explanation is sound. Nobody in this field disputes the basic mechanisms. Nutrition affects growth. Disease affects growth. Poverty, in the broad sense of limited access to adequate food and clean water, produces shorter populations. These are not contested claims. They are supported by studies across multiple modern populations as well as historical ones. At first, then, the explanation seems entirely reasonable. It fits the popular image of medieval and pre-modern life. Most people carry a mental picture of that world as harsh, physically limiting, and fundamentally inferior to modern conditions in almost every measurable way. The low doorways seem to confirm that picture. Look how small they had to be. Look how difficult their lives must have been. The buildings themselves appear to serve as evidence for the story. And to be fair, the mainstream historical narrative does not present this as a straightforward triumph. It acknowledges that the path from pre-modern conditions to modern ones involved significant hardship. But the overall direction of the narrative is one of gradual improvement. Things got better over time. Bodies got larger over time. The low ceilings of old buildings represent an earlier, harder stage that modernity eventually corrected. Progress produced taller people. Taller people built taller buildings. The story moves in one direction, but this is where it becomes unclear, because the skeletal record, the actual physical remains of people who lived across these centuries, does not describe a simple story of gradual improvement from a low baseline. It describes something considerably more complicated, and that complication has been sitting in the archaeological literature for decades, documented carefully, measured precisely, and largely absent from the popular version of this history that most people encounter. Bioarchaeologists have spent significant time and effort compiling height data from burial sites across Western Europe, England, France, Germany, the Scandinavian countries. Thousands of individual skeletons, measured and recorded, spanning a range of centuries. What this data shows, when it is laid out across time, is not a gradual climb from short to tall. It shows a pattern that the standard explanation does not predict and does not easily account for. People in the early centuries of the first millennium were not dramatically shorter than people today. The skeletal measurements from this period produce average male heights of around 5 feet 8 inches across multiple sites and multiple regions. Women of the same period average between 5 feet 2 and 5 feet 4. These are not the measurements of a severely stunted population. They are numbers that sit comfortably within the range of modern averages. A person of that height, from that period, placed in a modern context, would not stand out physically. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. If the pre-modern world consistently produced shorter people due to its harsher conditions, then people living 2,000 years ago in a world with no modern medicine, no industrial food systems, and no organized sanitation should have been among the shortest in the historical record. They should represent the baseline that gradual improvement then built upon. But they do not. They were close to modern average height, which means the simple story of pre-modern hardship producing short people, and modernity correcting that, does not describe what actually happened. What the skeletal record actually shows is a decline, not a baseline of shortness followed by improvement. A decline from a taller starting point, followed much later by a recovery. Average male height fell across several centuries, reaching its lowest recorded points in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, during the height of industrial expansion in Western Europe. Then it began to rise again. The trajectory is not a gradual improvement from low to high. It is a curve that starts relatively high, drops significantly over several centuries, bottoms out, and then climbs back up. This is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the low point in human height came during the industrial period, during a time of economic expansion and technological development, then the narrative of progress producing taller bodies does not hold as a simple linear story. Something was making ordinary people shorter during a period that is conventionally described as one of growth and advancement, and something before that, in periods that are conventionally described as harder and more primitive, was apparently keeping people taller. The official explanation does not fully account for this shape. It can acknowledge the dip by pointing to urban overcrowding, industrial pollution, and the specific miseries of early factory life. These factors are real, and they did affect health. But that response still does not explain why people were taller in the early medieval period than they were in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, before industrialization had even begun. The decline did not start with factories. It started earlier, and its starting point coincides with changes that had nothing to do with industrial development. Some researchers have pointed to this gap directly. The skeletal data from the medieval period, from the centuries between roughly 1200 and 1700, shows a steady downward trend in average height for laboring populations. Not a sudden collapse. A gradual, sustained reduction spread across generations, and it was not evenly distributed across the social spectrum. This is a detail that the standard explanation tends to pass over without much examination. The wealthy of the same periods did not shrink at the same rate. The height gap between aristocratic populations and laboring populations became measurably wider across these centuries, which raises a question that the universal pre-modern hardship explanation cannot easily answer. If the conditions of pre-modern life affected everyone, why did the poor get significantly shorter while the wealthy stayed the same height or grew taller? The answer cannot be genetics. Populations do not diverge genetically across a few centuries in ways that would produce this effect. The answer has to be environmental. Something in the lived conditions of laboring populations changed in ways that reduced their access to the specific inputs that determine height in early childhood, and something in the lived conditions of wealthier populations did not change in the same way, or changed much less. What that something was is where the investigation moves next. But it is worth staying here for a moment and sitting with the gap in the standard explanation, because the explanation is not wrong in every respect. The biological mechanisms it invokes are real. Nutrition matters. Disease matters. Early childhood conditions matter enormously. The explanation fails not because it identifies the wrong factors, but because it applies them too broadly and too simply. It treats pre-modern life as a uniform condition of hardship, and it treats the improvement of that condition as a straightforward product of modernity. The skeletal record says something more specific happened. A specific population, in a specific set of centuries, got smaller. Another population in the same time and place did not, and the timing of that divergence does not align neatly with the arrival of modern medicine or industrial food systems. The low ceilings in old buildings are real. The narrow doorways are real. The physical compression of those spaces compared to modern construction is real and measurable. But the explanation for why they are that way, the explanation printed on the information placard, the one repeated across generations of historical writing, may be describing a real phenomenon while pointing in the wrong direction for its cause. It answers the question of what happened to the bodies. It is less clear about why it happened when it did, to whom it happened most severely, and what the actual mechanism was. Those questions are not small. They sit at the center of how an entire civilization's history has been understood and narrated. And the skeletal record, sitting in museum archives and university storage facilities across Europe, carefully measured and documented, tells a story that is still waiting to be read correctly by the broader historical conversation. The bones are not ambiguous. The pattern they show is consistent. What remains unclear is why that pattern has not more fundamentally changed the standard explanation that most people still encounter when they walk through a low doorway and ask why it was built so small. That question does not have a simple answer, but it has a direction, and following that direction is where this investigation continues. The doubt does not begin with a theory. It begins with a measurement. Specifically, it begins with the kind of measurement that is difficult to argue with because it comes not from a written account, not from a historical document produced by someone with a particular interest in the outcome, but from bone, from the physical remains of people who lived, worked, and died across Western Europe over the course of many centuries. Bones do not have agendas. They do not simplify complex situations for a general audience. They record what happened to the body that carried them, and what the bones from this period record is something that does not fit comfortably inside the standard historical narrative. The field responsible for reading this record is called bioarchaeology. It sits at the intersection of archaeology and biological anthropology. Researchers in this field recover skeletal remains from burial sites, analyze them for information about the individuals they belong to, and use that information to draw conclusions about the populations those individuals came from. Height reconstruction is one of the most reliable methods available. The length of certain long bones, particularly the femur, correlates with overall height in ways that are well documented and consistently reproducible. When bioarchaeologists report a height figure for a historical population, they are not estimating loosely. They are working from a specific and tested methodology, and the results of that methodology, applied to thousands of skeletons recovered from sites across England, France, Germany, and Scandinavia, have produced findings that are consistent enough to be taken seriously. Men living in Western Europe around 100 AD averaged approximately 5 feet 8 inches in height. Women of the same period averaged between 5 feet 2 and 5 feet 4. These numbers appear across multiple independent studies, conducted by different researchers, working from different burial sites in different countries. The consistency is not perfect. There's regional variation. There are site-specific differences. But the general pattern holds across enough data points that dismissing it requires a specific argument, not simply a general skepticism. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. 5 feet 8 inches is not a small number. It sits within the normal range for modern Western European male height. A man of that height today would not be considered short. He would be considered average, perhaps slightly below average in some Northern European populations, but entirely unremarkable. Place him on a modern street, and nothing about his physical stature would draw attention. Yet this is the average height being recorded for men living 2,000 years ago. In a world with no antibiotics, no modern food distribution, no sanitation infrastructure, and none of the medical interventions that the standard explanation credits with producing larger modern bodies. This is where the official explanation begins to weaken, because the explanation rests on a specific assumption. That assumption is that pre-modern life, defined by its lack of modern medicine, modern food systems, and modern sanitation, consistently produced shorter people. That the low doorways and cramped ceilings of old buildings represent a baseline condition of pre-modern physical diminishment, and that modernity corrected that condition by improving the circumstances of daily life. The direction of the story runs from small to large, from worse to better, from pre-modern limitation to modern improvement. But the skeletal data from 100 AD does not represent a low baseline. It represents a height average that is competitive with modern figures, which means the story cannot simply be one of continuous improvement from a low starting point. Something else happened. The heights did not start low and climb gradually. They started relatively high, then fell, and then eventually climbed back. That is a completely different shape, and a different shape requires a different explanation. The decline is documented as clearly as the starting point. By the year 1400, average male height in Western Europe had dropped to approximately 5 feet 5 inches. By 1600, it had fallen further. The lowest recorded averages in some regions of England came in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, during the period of industrialization, when male height in certain areas reached approximately 5 feet 3 inches. That represents a reduction of roughly 5 inches from the figures recorded 1,700 years earlier. 5 inches is not a minor variation. It is a substantial and sustained physical change across an entire population. And it did not happen overnight. It accumulated across generations, written incrementally into the bones of people who had no way of knowing that their bodies were recording a history that researchers would one day read. At first, it seems normal to attribute this to the generally difficult conditions of medieval life. But there is a problem. The decline did not occur uniformly across all social groups. This is the detail that the standard explanation handles most poorly. If pre-modern hardship was the primary driver of reduced height, and if that hardship affected the population broadly, then the height decline should be visible across all social classes. The wealthy should have shrunk alongside the poor. They did not. The skeletal record from the same centuries that showed declining heights for laboring populations shows something different for aristocratic and wealthy populations. The height gap between the upper and lower classes became measurably wider across the medieval and early modern periods. By the 16th century, the difference in average height between aristocrats and agricultural laborers was pronounced enough that contemporary writers commented on it in their own documents, interpreting it as evidence of natural superiority in noble bloodlines. It was not bloodlines, but whatever it was not universal pre-modern hardship, because hardship of that kind does not spare one social group while diminishing another. Something specific was affecting laboring populations in ways that wealthier populations were not experiencing to the same degree, and that something had to be connected to the specific inputs that determine height in early childhood: protein, calories, freedom from chronic infection. These are the variables that control whether a child reaches their genetic height potential or falls short of it. The wealthy had better access to all three. The laboring poor had less access. But the question is not simply that the wealthy ate better, which is obvious and unremarkable. The question is what specifically changed about the diet and living conditions of laboring populations during the centuries of decline, and why that change happened when it did. This raises questions that the standard explanation does not fully answer, because the skeletal decline began well before industrialization. The trend is visible in the data from the 14th and 15th centuries. This is important because industrialization is often used as a partial explanation for the height dip, and that explanation has some validity for the specific period it covers. Urban overcrowding, factory conditions, child labor, and the specific miseries of early industrial life did affect health and growth. But those conditions belong to the 18th and 19th centuries. The decline was already underway centuries before the first factory was built. Something was reducing the nutritional status of ordinary people long before the Industrial Revolution gave historians a convenient explanation to reach for. The timeline does not fully match the standard account. Some researchers have noted that the centuries of steepest decline in laboring population height correspond closely with a different set of historical changes. Changes in land access, changes in the legal structure governing what ordinary families could do with the land around them, what animals they could keep, what resources they could draw on to supplement a diet that was otherwise dominated by grain. These changes began in England in the 13th century and continued through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Their timing overlaps with the height decline in ways that have led some researchers to suggest a direct connection. Others are more cautious, pointing out that correlation between two historical trends does not establish that one caused the other, and that the relationship between land access and nutritional status, while plausible, requires more specific evidence to be claimed as a primary driver. That caution is reasonable, but it does not dissolve the question. It sharpens it, because the skeletal record is not making a political argument. It is not attached to any particular interpretation of history. It simply shows what it shows. People were taller in the earlier centuries. They got shorter in the later centuries. The reduction was steepest among the poor. The wealthy did not experience the same reduction. The timeline of the decline does not align neatly with the arrival of conditions that the standard explanation typically invokes. These are observations about the data. What they mean, and what caused them, is where the genuine debate lies. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the bones are not the only physical record available. There are also the buildings. The doorways in English farmhouses built before 1400 are, on measurable average, taller than the doorways in farmhouses built between 1600 and 1800. Researchers who have documented this have noted that the change is not explained by shifts in construction technique or available materials. It tracks the height of the people who built those structures. Taller people in earlier centuries built taller doorways. Shorter people in later centuries built shorter ones. The buildings are calibrated to their builders, and the calibration shifted downward across the same centuries that the skeletal record shows average height declining. This convergence of two independent data sources, skeletal measurements and architectural measurements, pointing in the same direction across the same time period, is not something that can be easily set aside. It does not prove any particular cause, but it confirms that the height decline was real, that it was substantial, and that it left traces in everything the people of those centuries built and left behind. What it does not confirm is why, and that is the question that the standard explanation, for all its surface plausibility, has not fully resolved. The narrative of pre-modern hardship producing smaller bodies is not wrong in identifying the relevant biological mechanisms. It is inadequate in explaining the specific shape of the historical record. A baseline of smallness, followed by gradual improvement, would fit the narrative. A peak followed by centuries of decline, followed by a recovery, does not. That shape requires an explanation that accounts for what changed during the centuries of decline, not just what improved during the centuries of recovery. The bones from 100 AD are sitting in archives and university collections across Europe. Measured, documented, catalogued. They show men averaging 5 feet 8 inches. The bones from 1700 AD show men averaging considerably less. Both sets of bones come from populations living in the same general geographic region, descended from broadly similar genetic backgrounds, separated by centuries of history that changed their world in ways that are still being understood. The difference between those two sets of measurements is not a curiosity. It is a historical problem, and it is one that the standard explanation, as it has been repeated across generations of historical writing, has not yet fully solved. That gap is not comfortable to sit with, but sitting with it is necessary, because the bones say something happened, something specific, something sustained, something that affected the poor more severely than the wealthy, and that began its work well before the explanations most commonly offered for it were even possible. What that something was remains a genuine question, and genuine questions, particularly ones written this clearly into the physical record of a civilization, deserve more than a repeated answer that does not quite fit the shape of the evidence. To understand what might have driven the height decline, it helps to step back from the skeletal data for a moment and look at something more grounded, something more practical. It helps to look at how ordinary people in early medieval Europe actually lived, not the way they are commonly imagined, not the popular version of medieval peasant life, which tends toward images of desperate poverty, empty bowls, and unrelenting misery. The actual picture, as reconstructed from historical records, legal documents, and archaeological evidence, is considerably more complex than that image allows for. This does not mean early medieval life was comfortable. It was not. Physical labor was constant. Winters were difficult. Medical care as a concept barely existed. Life expectancy was shorter, though much of that difference is explained by high childhood mortality rather than adults dying young across the board. The point is not that peasant life in this period was good. The point is that it was not nutritionally empty in the way the popular image suggests. And that distinction matters enormously when the question being investigated is why people were taller then than they would be several centuries later. The key factor that most general histories pass over without much attention is a legal and economic institution that shaped the daily material reality of ordinary families across most of Western Europe during this period. It is called the commons, and the word in modern usage has been flattened into something vague. When people today hear the term, they might think of a town square, a shared green space, something pleasant and slightly romantic. But the historical commons was not a park. It was a system of legally defined rights, specific, documented, enforceable rights attached to specific pieces of land, held by specific families, often across multiple generations. These rights were not charity. That point is worth emphasizing, because the modern instinct is to frame anything received by peasants from the land around them as something granted by a lord, something given from above that could be taken back at will. The commons did not work that way, at least not in its functioning medieval form. A family with grazing rights on the village green had a legal claim to those rights. They could assert that claim in court. The right was attached to their landholding, passed down within the family, and recognized within the local legal framework as genuine property. It was not a favor. It was a right, and the range of these rights was wider than most people realize. Grazing rights allowed a family to keep a defined number of animals on common land. Estovers gave the right to cut wood for fuel and for fencing. Piscary rights granted access to designated fishing waters. Turbary rights allowed the cutting of peat for fuel. Each of these was specific. Each was legally recognized. And together, they gave ordinary laboring families access to a range of resources that supplemented what their own small plots of land could produce. The combination of these rights created something that is easy to underestimate from a modern vantage point. It created a nutritional floor. At first, that might seem like a minor economic detail, but there is a problem with treating it as minor. The most nutritionally significant of these rights, in terms of their effect on the human body, were the ones that provided access to animal protein. Grazing rights meant pigs, chickens, occasionally a cow. These animals were not luxury items. They were protein sources. And protein, particularly in the first 3 years of a child's life, is not a supplement to an adequate diet. It is a primary determinant of whether that diet is adequate at all. The biological relationship between early childhood protein intake and adult height is one of the most robustly documented findings in the study of human development. A child who receives sufficient protein during that early window reaches their genetic height potential. A child who does not will be permanently shorter. The shortfall cannot be corrected afterward. The window closes. The outcome is fixed in the skeleton. This is where the commons becomes directly relevant to the skeletal record. Peasant families in the early medieval period who held common rights had access to pigs and chickens as part of their ordinary household economy. Not in large numbers, not abundantly, but enough to provide animal protein on a regular basis to young children during exactly the developmental window that determines adult height. The skeletal evidence from this period is consistent with a population that was meeting basic nutritional requirements, not thriving by any modern standard, but not falling below the threshold that stunts skeletal development. The bones from this period are the bones of people who, while living difficult lives, were getting enough of the right inputs during early childhood to reach something close to their genetic height potential. This is not a widely emphasized point in general histories of medieval life. The popular narrative tends to flatten the experience of peasants into uniform deprivation, but the evidence, when examined carefully, suggests a more specific picture. It was not that peasants had abundant food. It was that their access to the commons gave them enough variety in their diet, particularly enough animal protein, to sustain adequate early childhood nutrition. Remove that access, and the nutritional floor disappears. The question is whether that is what eventually happened. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the commons was not a simple or static institution. It varied significantly by region, by local custom, by the specific terms attached to particular landholdings. In some areas the rights were well documented and actively defended. In others they were more informal and more vulnerable. This variation makes it difficult to draw a single clean line between the existence of the commons and the height data from any specific period. Some researchers caution against oversimplifying the relationship, noting that the commons was already under pressure in some regions by the 12th and 13th centuries, earlier than the most dramatic height declines, while in other regions common rights persisted well into the early modern period. That complexity is real and it deserves acknowledgement, but it does not dissolve the underlying question. It sharpens it. If the relationship between common rights and nutritional status was real, then regions where those rights were eroded earliest should show earlier height declines. Regions where they persisted longest should show later and shallower declines. Whether the historical data supports that geographic pattern is a question that researchers have begun examining, and the early findings are suggestive, though not yet conclusive. This is the kind of detail that keeps the investigation open rather than closed. What is less ambiguous is the biological mechanism connecting common rights to child development. Human height in the first 3 years of life is determined by 3 primary inputs: protein intake, calorie intake, and freedom from chronic infection, which matters because a body fighting repeated illness during early childhood diverts metabolic resources away from growth. The commons, at its most functional, contributed meaningfully to all 3. Animal protein from household livestock, caloric supplementation from a variety of foraged and cultivated foods available through common access, and less directly, a rural dispersed settlement pattern that reduced the density-driven disease burden that would later become catastrophic in urban industrial settings. Remove the commons from that equation and the nutritional floor does not just lower, it potentially disappears for the most vulnerable members of laboring families. Young children, whose protein needs are high relative to their body size, and whose developmental window is narrow and unforgiving, would be the first to be affected, and the effect would not be visible immediately. It would accumulate across a generation. Children who received inadequate early nutrition would reach adulthood shorter than their parents. Their children, if conditions continued to worsen, might be shorter still. The decline would be gradual, spread across decades and generations, written incrementally into the skeletal record in ways that would only become clear when someone measured enough bones from enough burial sites across enough centuries to see the pattern. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the timeline of the commons and the timeline of the height decline are not perfectly synchronized. The commons was still functioning, in varying degrees, across much of Western Europe during the period when average heights were still relatively high. Its erosion was gradual, contested, and uneven. The height decline was also gradual. Whether the two gradual processes were directly connected, running in parallel because one was causing the other, or whether they were both responding to some third set of factors, is a question the current evidence can raise more clearly than it can answer. What the evidence can say with more confidence is that the commons was not a trivial institution. It was not a background detail of medieval economic life. It was a functional system that gave ordinary families legal access to resources that directly supported the nutritional requirements of early childhood development. And the skeletal record from the period when those rights were most intact shows populations reaching heights that the standard narrative of pre-modern deprivation does not predict. That gap between what the narrative predicts and what the bones show is not a gap in the data. It is a gap in the explanation. The data is relatively clear. People in early medieval Western Europe were taller than people would be several centuries later. Those earlier people had access, through common rights, to protein sources that sustained adequate early childhood nutrition. Later people, in the centuries of steepest height decline, lived in a landscape where those common rights were under increasing pressure. Whether that pressure was the cause of the height decline, one cause among several, or a correlate of other causes, is a question that requires more specific investigation. But the commons, as a historical institution, deserves more attention than it typically receives in the standard histories of this period. It is usually treated as a footnote to the larger story of agricultural development, a pre-modern arrangement that was eventually replaced by more efficient systems. What the skeletal record suggests is that it may have been doing something more important than the standard histories acknowledge, something that its disappearance would affect not in the abstract terms of economic efficiency or legal rights, but in the very specific and measurable terms of how tall the children of the families who lost it would eventually grow. What happened to those rights? In the centuries that followed the period being examined here is where the story moves next. But it is worth pausing on what those rights represented while they existed. They were not a romantic vision of medieval communal harmony. They were a practical system, a legal mechanism that connected ordinary families to the resources their bodies needed. And the bodies, as recorded in the skeletal evidence, reflected that connection. Not perfectly, not without variation, but consistently enough that the pattern is visible across thousands of measurements from sites spread across an entire continent. The commons kept people fed in a specific and biologically meaningful way. And the question of what happened when it stopped doing so is one that the investigation has not yet fully answered. The direction that answer points is becoming clearer, but the full picture is still assembling itself from bones, documents, and the dimensions of doorways built by people whose bodies were telling a story they had no way of knowing they were writing. Somewhere in the parliamentary archives of England, there are thousands of individual legal documents. Each one is specific to a place, a parish, a set of fields, a particular arrangement of land that had, up to the moment that document was passed into law, supported the shared rights of multiple families across multiple generations. Each document has a date, a location, a set of legal terms, and each one represents a transfer, rights that had been held collectively, in some cases for longer than anyone alive at the time could remember, moved into the hands of a single owner. The process these documents collectively describe has a name. It is called enclosure, and it is one of the most significant and least examined transformations in the social and physical history of Western Europe. The word enclosure sounds technical, administrative. It sounds like the kind of term that belongs in an economic history textbook, surrounded by other terms that most people will never need to use. And that is part of the problem, because the technical language obscures what enclosure actually was in practical terms for the families it affected. It was not an abstract legal rearrangement. It was the removal of the specific resources that ordinary families had depended on to feed their children. And the consequences of that removal were not recorded in the parliamentary documents. They were recorded in the bones. The process began in England around the 13th century. It was not sudden. It did not arrive as a single policy or a single decision. It accumulated across centuries, driven by different motivations at different times, carried forward by different legal mechanisms in different periods. In the earliest phases, the pressure came primarily from landowners seeking to convert common grazing land to sheep pasture, which was more profitable in the wool economy of the late medieval period. Later phases were driven by arguments about agricultural efficiency and modernization. The rhetoric changed across the centuries. The direction did not. Common land contracted. Private ownership expanded. The families who had held common rights found those rights progressively narrowed, challenged, and eventually eliminated. Parliament became the primary instrument of this process in its later and most intensive phases. Between 1700 and 1900, Parliament passed over 4,000 individual enclosure acts. Each one was specific. Each one targeted a defined geographical area. Each one was the product of a legal petition process that, in practice, favored the interests of larger landowners who had the resources to navigate it. The smaller commoners, the families whose rights were being extinguished, rarely had the legal knowledge or the financial means to mount effective opposition. The process was formally open. In practice, it was weighted. The compensation offered to former commoners when their rights were enclosed was, in most documented cases, inadequate. This is not a contested point. Historians of enclosure across the political spectrum have acknowledged that the compensation structures typically failed to replicate the economic value of what was being lost. Families sometimes received small parcels of land in exchange for their common rights, but those parcels were often too small to support the kind of mixed smallholding that the commons had made possible. Others received cash payments, but cash payments, unlike common rights, were finite. They could be spent, lost, or consumed by a single difficult season, and once spent, they were gone. The common rights they replaced had been permanent. They had been renewable. They had been, in a meaningful economic sense, a form of wealth that regenerated itself each season without requiring additional investment. By 1850, common land in England had been reduced to roughly 3% of what it had been in 1500. That number deserves a moment of attention. 3%. That is not a gradual adjustment to changing conditions. That is near total elimination. The institution that had provided ordinary families with grazing rights, woodcutting rights, fishing rights, and access to the animal protein those rights supported had been reduced, across 3.5 centuries of legal process, to almost nothing. At first, this seems like a purely economic and legal story, a story about property rights and land ownership and the development of agricultural capitalism. And it is that story. But there's a problem with stopping there. The nutritional status of laboring populations in England declined during exactly the same period that enclosure was most aggressively proceeding. This is not a vague correlation. The timing is specific enough to be examined carefully. As common rights contracted, the household economies of laboring families changed in ways that are documented in multiple sources. Pigs, which had been a standard feature of the peasant smallholding when common grazing land was available, began to disappear from laboring households. Without access to common land where pigs could forage, keeping them became impractical. Chickens, which had been raised for household consumption, increasingly became market goods, sold rather than eaten, because the cash income they represented was more immediately necessary than the protein they provided. The protein that had sustained the skeletal record of earlier centuries began to vanish from the ordinary working diet. This is where the first real inconsistency in the official account appears, and it is worth sitting with it directly rather than moving past it. Enclosure was justified, in the official language of its time, primarily as an agricultural improvement. The argument was efficiency. Consolidated, privately managed land was more productive than fragmented, commonly managed land. Yields would increase. The food supply would expand. Everyone would ultimately benefit from a more rational and modern organization of agricultural production. That was the argument made in parliamentary debates. It was the argument made in the economic literature of the period. It was the argument that has echoed through the historical accounts written in the centuries since. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Because if enclosure was primarily about improving agricultural output and ultimately improving the food supply, why did the nutritional status of the laboring population decline so sharply and so consistently during exactly the period when enclosure was most actively proceeding? The efficiency gains were real. Agricultural productivity did increase in measurable ways, but those gains did not translate into improved nutrition for laboring families. They translated into market output, into surplus that entered commercial channels, into profit for landowners. The food supply as an abstraction may have expanded. The food available within the household economies of ordinary laboring families contracted. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The distinction between aggregate food production and household food access is not a minor economic technicality. It is the difference between a population that is feeding its children adequately and one that is not. A laboring family in 1500 with common rights to grazing land and the chickens and pig that those rights supported was able to provide animal protein to its young children as a regular part of their diet. A laboring family in 1750 that had lost those rights and was dependent entirely on wages to purchase food was in a fundamentally different nutritional position. Not because less food existed in the world around them, because the mechanism by which they accessed food had changed in ways that systematically reduced the variety and protein content of what they were able to provide to their children during the developmental window that determines adult height. This raises questions that the standard account of enclosure does not adequately engage with. The histories of enclosure that fill academic shelves document the legal process in detail. They document the economic transformation it produced. They document the social dislocation, the rural depopulation, the growth of urban poverty, the migration of former agricultural laborers into industrial towns and cities. What they document with far less attention is what happened to the bodies of the children born into families that lost their common rights. That gap in the historical literature is not small. It represents the physical consequence of the process being described, and it is sitting in the skeletal record, waiting to be connected to the legal and economic story that caused it. Some historians have pointed to this gap and suggested that it reflects something about who has traditionally written economic history and whose experience has been centered in those accounts. This is a structural observation rather than an accusation of deliberate omission. The scholars who established the canonical narratives of agricultural development in the 19th and early 20th centuries largely worked within institutions shaped by the economic classes that had benefited from enclosure. The efficiency gains, the productivity increases, the foundations for industrial capitalism. These were the aspects of enclosure that those narratives emphasized. The contracting diet of laboring families, the disappearing pigs, the children who grew up shorter than their grandparents. These were not the aspects that received sustained analytical attention. However, the timeline does not fully match the official account in another important respect. Enclosure is sometimes discussed as if its effects were primarily an 18th and 19th century phenomenon, associated with the Industrial Revolution and the specific conditions of early industrial Britain. But the skeletal decline in laboring populations predates that period. The height reduction is visible in the data from the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Enclosure was already underway during this earlier period. The earlier phases were less dramatic in their parliamentary documentation, less visible in the legal record, but no less real in their effects on common land availability and household food access for ordinary families. The pigs did not disappear all at once. The chickens did not move from household food to market good overnight. The process was gradual, regional, uneven, but the direction was consistent, and the skeletal record, read across the same centuries, shows a consistent downward direction in average height for laboring populations. Two gradual processes moving in the same direction across the same centuries. One documented in parliamentary archives and legal records, the other documented in burial sites and university storage boxes full of carefully measured bones. Whether one caused the other, whether they were both produced by some larger set of forces, or whether their alignment is more coincidental than causal, is a question that researchers have not yet fully resolved. The connection is suggestive. The timing is uncomfortable in the way that timing becomes uncomfortable when two things that seem like they should be connected appear to move together across a very long period. But suggestive is not the same as proven, and uncomfortable timing is not the same as established causation. What can be said is that the official account of enclosure, as it has been written and repeated across the historical literature, does not engage seriously with its nutritional consequences for laboring families. The efficiency argument is present. The productivity data is present. The political and legal history is present in considerable detail. The bodies are largely absent. And bodies, as this investigation has been tracing from the beginning, are where the physical evidence of what happened to ordinary people during this period is most clearly and most permanently recorded. The parliamentary documents are still in the archives. The skeletal data is still in the collections. The two bodies of evidence sit in their separate institutional locations, rarely placed directly alongside each other in the same analysis. And the question of what the bones would say if they were asked directly about the legal documents that were being signed during the centuries of their decline remains, for now, more open than the standard account of either history acknowledges. When researchers began mapping height data against historical timelines, they were not looking for a dramatic finding. They were doing the slow, methodical work of compiling measurements from skeletal remains, cross-referencing burial site data with known historical periods, and building a picture of how human body size changed across centuries in Western Europe. The work was not glamorous. It involved archives, storage collections, careful bone measurements, and statistical analysis spread across years of research. What emerged from that work was not what the standard historical narrative predicted, and the pattern, once visible, proved difficult to set aside. The numbers themselves are worth examining directly. Average male height in Western Europe around 100 AD measured approximately 5 feet 8 inches. That figure comes from skeletal data compiled across multiple independent studies, from burial sites in England, France, Germany, and Scandinavia. It is not a single data point from a single site. It is a consistent average across a substantial body of physical evidence. By 1400, that average had dropped to approximately 5 feet 5 inches, a reduction of 3 inches across roughly 13 centuries. That alone would be significant, but the decline did not stop there. By 1600, the average had fallen further, to roughly 5 feet 4 inches. And the lowest point in the recorded data came later still, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, during the period most associated with industrial expansion and economic growth. In some regions of England during this period, average male height reached approximately 5 feet 3 inches. That is a total reduction of 5 inches from the figures recorded in the early centuries of the first millennium. 5 inches, accumulated across roughly 17 centuries, written into the bones of generation after generation of ordinary people who had no awareness that their bodies were recording a historical pattern that researchers would one day read. At first, this seems like it might simply confirm the standard narrative. Pre-modern life was hard. Bodies reflected that hardship. Modernity eventually corrected the problem. But there's a problem with that reading, and it sits at the center of the data in a way that is difficult to explain away. The decline was not distributed evenly across the population. This is the detail that makes the official explanation significantly harder to sustain. If the height reduction across these centuries was primarily a product of the general conditions of pre-modern life, conditions that affected everyone living in that world, then the decline should be visible across all social groups. Laboring families and aristocratic families alike should show the same downward trend because they were all living in the same pre-modern world, subject to the same absence of modern medicine, the same pre-industrial food systems, the same general environmental conditions that the standard explanation invokes as its primary cause. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the skeletal record does not show a uniform decline across social groups. It shows something considerably more specific. The poor shrank. The wealthy, by comparison, did not. The height gap between laboring populations and aristocratic populations widened measurably across the centuries of steepest decline. This is documented not only in the skeletal data, but in the written records of the period itself. By the 16th century, the physical difference between a well-fed aristocrat and a laboring commoner was visible enough that contemporaries commented on it directly in their writing. They did not interpret it as evidence of differential nutrition. They interpreted it as evidence of natural superiority. Noble blood, and the understanding of the time, produced larger bodies. That was simply how things were. That explanation was wrong, but the observation behind it was accurate. The bodies of wealthy people were measurably larger than the bodies of poor people during this period, and the gap had grown wide enough to be noticed without any specialized measurement tools, simply by looking. A 16th century writer observing the difference in physical stature between a lord and a laborer was observing something real. The interpretation was incorrect. The phenomenon was not. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because genetics cannot account for that divergence. The aristocratic families of 16th century England were not a genetically distinct population that had developed heritable traits for greater height. They were, in genetic terms, broadly continuous with the population around them. Families moved between social classes across generations. Marriages crossed social boundaries. The gene pool of the English aristocracy was not sealed off from the gene pool of the English laboring population in any way that would produce a heritable height advantage of the magnitude being observed, which means the explanation for the height gap has to be environmental. Something in the lived conditions of aristocratic families was producing larger bodies. Something in the lived conditions of laboring families was producing smaller ones. And those two sets of conditions were diverging across exactly the centuries when the skeletal record shows the gap widening. The most straightforward environmental explanation involves food. Specifically, it involves the consistent and uninterrupted access to animal protein that wealthy families maintained across these centuries, and that laboring families were losing. This is where the enclosure timeline becomes directly relevant to the height data. Aristocratic and wealthy families did not lose access to common land when enclosure proceeded, because their relationship to land was not based on common rights. It was based on ownership. Enclosure did not remove their resources. In many cases it expanded them, consolidating land and rights that had previously been shared into private holdings that increased the economic power of those who already held significant property. The nutritional baseline of wealthy families was not affected by the contraction of the commons. The nutritional baseline of laboring families was affected directly and substantially. That alignment between the divergence in land access and the divergence in body size is what researchers have found difficult to explain away. It is not a perfect correlation. No historical correlation of this complexity ever is. Disease patterns varied by region and period. Climate shifts affected agricultural output in ways that influenced food availability independently of land tenure arrangements. Warfare disrupted food systems in specific regions at specific times. All of these factors introduced variation into the height data that cannot simply be attributed to a single cause. The researchers who have made this argument most carefully have been consistent in acknowledging those complications. But acknowledging complicating factors is not the same as dismissing the underlying pattern. And the pattern, when examined across the full dataset, is consistent enough to require engagement. In regions where enclosure was most aggressive and most complete, the height decline in laboring populations was steepest. In regions where common land persisted longer, where peasant access to small-scale animal husbandry survived into later centuries, the decline was shallower. This regional variation within the same general historical period is one of the strongest pieces of evidence for a connection between land access and nutritional status. If the decline were primarily driven by universal pre-modern conditions, the regional variation tied to enclosure patterns would not be expected. But it is present, and it is consistent in its direction. However, the timeline does not fully match the simplest version of the enclosure argument either. The height decline begins before the most intensive phases of parliamentary enclosure. The skeletal data shows the downward trend starting in the medieval period, in some regions as early as the 13th and 14th centuries, which corresponds with the earlier and less formally documented phases of common land pressure, but predates the major parliamentary enclosure acts by several centuries. This means the relationship between enclosure and height decline is not a simple before and after story. It is a more gradual and more complex process in which pressure on common land access built across centuries, producing a nutritional effect that also accumulated across centuries, rather than appearing suddenly at any single legal or political moment. This raises questions about how the connection should be understood. Was enclosure the cause of the height decline, in a direct and primary sense? Or was it one significant factor among several, whose effects combined with disease patterns, climate variation, and other forces to produce the observed skeletal record? The honest answer is that the current evidence supports the second interpretation more clearly than the first. Land access appears to have been a major driver of nutritional status for laboring populations. Nutritional status was clearly a major driver of height, but the relationship was not exclusive, and the researchers making these arguments have generally been careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. What the evidence does support, clearly and consistently, is that the height gap between wealthy and laboring populations was real, was large, and grew larger across the centuries of steepest height decline. And that gap cannot be explained by genetics, by universal pre-modern hardship, or by any factor that would be expected to affect all social classes equally. It requires an explanation that is specific to the differential experience of wealthy and laboring populations during this period. And the most consistently supported candidate for that differential experience is access to the resources that determine early childhood nutrition. The wealthy had land. They had animals. They had reliable protein. Their children grew up in households where the specific inputs that determine adult height were consistently available during the early developmental window that makes those inputs matter. Laboring families, across the centuries of enclosure, were progressively losing access to exactly those resources. The pigs that had grazed on common land were gone. The chickens that had supplemented the household diet were gone. What remained was a diet more heavily dependent on grain, on purchased food, on wages that fluctuated with seasons and harvests, and the demands of employers who had no structural obligation to ensure that their workers' children received adequate early nutrition. The 5-inch decline in average male height across these centuries is not an abstraction. It represents millions of individual children whose bodies did not reach the potential encoded in their genetics because the specific inputs required during the first 3 years of life were not consistently available to them. It represents a population-level change in physical size that accumulated silently, generation by generation, visible only in retrospect when enough skeletal data had been compiled to reveal the pattern. And it was not distributed randomly across the population. It fell most heavily on the families who lost the most, the families whose common rights were extinguished, whose pigs disappeared, whose children grew up in households where protein was consistently harder to access than it had been for their grandparents. That is what the height data shows when it is mapped against the historical timeline. Not a uniform story of pre-modern hardship affecting everyone equally. A specific story of differential loss, written into the bodies of the people who experienced it, preserved in their bones, and sitting in the skeletal record, waiting for the questions being asked of it now to have been asked much earlier. Why the gap between the evidence and the standard explanation persisted for so long, and what that persistence reflects about how historical knowledge is produced and whose experience it tends to center, is itself a question that the data raises without fully resolving. The pattern is in the numbers. The numbers are in the bones, and the bones have been available for anyone willing to read them carefully for longer than the standard explanation has been willing to look. One of the more reliable tools in historical research is the cross-national comparison. When a pattern appears in one country, it could reflect local conditions, specific policies, specific geography, specific cultural arrangements that produced a particular outcome in that place without broader significance. A single country showing a correlation between land reform and population height might be interesting. It might warrant further investigation, but it could also be explained by factors unique to that country's particular history. This is why the pattern being examined here becomes considerably harder to dismiss when it is placed in a wider geographic context, because it does not appear in one country. It appears across multiple countries, with different political systems, different legal traditions, different languages, and different stated motivations for the land reforms they each carried out. And in each of them, the skeletal record shows the same directional relationship. England is the most extensively documented case. The Parliamentary Enclosure Acts, the legal records, the agricultural history, the economic data, All of this has been studied in considerable detail over many decades. The English case provides the clearest paper trail connecting land reform to changes in common land access, and the English skeletal data has been compiled from enough burial sites across enough centuries to show the height pattern with reasonable confidence. But England is one country, and one country, however well documented, is not a pattern. It is a starting point. France presents a different political story entirely. The French Revolution of the late 18th century abolished the feudal structures that had organized land and social relations in France for centuries. It is remembered primarily as a political transformation, a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between citizens and the state, between common people and the aristocracy that had dominated their lives. And in those terms it was genuinely radical. But the revolution also had consequences for communal land arrangements that are less often discussed in the general historical accounts of that period. The abolition of feudal rights, which the revolution carried out as part of its broader dismantling of the old social order, also dissolved many of the communal arrangements through which ordinary French families had accessed shared land resources. The revolution did not intend to privatize communal land, but in practice, the elimination of the legal frameworks that had supported communal access, combined with subsequent policies that encouraged individual land ownership, accelerated the movement of formerly shared land into private hands. Different political motivation, different legal mechanism, same structural outcome, and the French skeletal record, compiled by researchers working independently of the English bioarchaeological studies, shows height patterns during this period that align with what the English data shows. Laboring populations in France did not maintain the heights recorded in earlier centuries. The decline is present in the French data as it is in the English data. The timing and the steepness vary by region and by the specific local history of land access in each area, but the directional consistency is there. This is where the single-country explanation begins to lose its footing. Prussia offers yet another variation. The Prussian agricultural reforms of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were carried out under the explicit banner of modernization and efficiency. Prussia was attempting to rationalize its agricultural economy, to move away from older communal and feudal arrangements toward a more modern system of individual land ownership and consolidated farming. The political context was entirely different from both the English parliamentary process and the French revolutionary moment. Prussia was not abolishing an aristocracy. It was not responding to popular revolution. It was implementing administrative reforms designed by state officials who believed they were building a more productive and modern agricultural system. The rhetoric was entirely about efficiency and national economic development. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the structural effect of those Prussian reforms, evaluated in terms of what they did to the land access of ordinary laboring families, was not substantially different from what the English Enclosure Acts or the French revolutionary land policies produced. Communal arrangements contracted. Private ownership expanded. The resources that had supplemented the household economies of ordinary families through shared access to land were progressively absorbed into consolidated private holdings. Different politics, different language, different stated purpose. Same result for the families whose common access disappeared. The Scandinavian experience adds another dimension to this comparison. The timing and the mechanisms of land reform varied across the Scandinavian countries, and the depth and speed of common land contraction differed from the English and French experiences in important ways. In some Scandinavian regions, common land arrangements persisted longer and were dismantled more gradually. And in those regions, the skeletal data shows something that is itself significant. The height decline, while present, was shallower than in regions where land reform was more aggressive and more complete. This regional variation within Scandinavia, where the depth of the height decline tracks against the pace of common land contraction, is the kind of internal evidence within a single geographic area that strengthens the case for a connection between the two. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. If the height decline in laboring populations were driven primarily by factors that affected all pre-modern populations equally, such as disease, climate, or the general conditions of pre-modern life, then the variation between regions within Scandinavia should not correlate with the pace of land reform in those regions. The disease environment and the climate were not significantly different between a region where common land persisted until 1800 and a neighboring region where it had contracted by 1700. But the height data is different between those regions, and the difference aligns with the land reform timeline, not with any other variable that has been identified and measured. This is not a perfect correlation. That point deserves emphasis. Researchers who work with this data are careful to acknowledge that height is determined by multiple factors, and that no single historical variable can fully account for the observed changes across centuries and across countries. Disease played a role. The repeated plague epidemics beginning in the 14th century affected nutrition and development in ways that are difficult to separate from the effects of land access changes. Climate shifts during the Little Ice Age reduced agricultural output in ways that affected food availability independently of land tenure arrangements. Warfare disrupted food systems and displaced populations in ways that introduced additional variability into the skeletal record. None of these factors can simply be set aside, but acknowledging complicating factors is different from dismissing the pattern. And the pattern, when the data from England, France, Prussia, and Scandinavia is placed alongside each other, shows a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. Researchers working in these different national contexts were not, in most cases, working from a shared theoretical framework or a shared political interpretation. They were working from the physical evidence available to them in their own national archives and burial sites. They were measuring bones from French farmland and English churchyards and Scandinavian burial mounds, and they were finding the same directional relationship independently, using the same basic methodology, pointing toward the same general conclusion. When independent researchers, working from different national datasets, using different source materials, arrive at findings that point in the same direction, that convergence is methodologically significant. It does not prove causation. It does not eliminate alternative explanations, but it does move the pattern from the category of local curiosity to the category of something that requires a serious cross-national explanation. And the most consistently available cross-national factor, the one that was present in England and France and Prussia and Scandinavia, that proceeded through different political mechanisms but produced the same structural outcome for ordinary laboring families, was the contraction of common land access. However, the timeline does not fully match in every national case. The French Revolutionary period is particularly complicated because the abolition of feudal rights had effects that were not uniform across French territory. Some regions of France retained more communal land arrangements than others well into the 19th century, and the French skeletal data from those regions is not yet as comprehensively compiled as the English data, which means the regional variation within France that would most directly test the connection between land access and height is not yet fully visible in the research literature. This is an acknowledged gap in the current state of the evidence. It does not invalidate the broader pattern, but it means the French case is not yet as clearly resolved as the English and Scandinavian cases. This raises questions about what the pattern, as currently documented, actually establishes. Some researchers are confident that the cross-national consistency is strong enough to treat land access as a primary driver of the nutritional changes that produced the height decline. Others are more cautious, arguing that the evidence is suggestive but not yet conclusive across all the national cases, and that more comprehensive skeletal data from more regions is needed before the connection can be stated with the confidence that the strongest version of the argument implies. Both positions are represented in the current research literature. Neither has definitively displaced the other. What both positions agree on is that the standard economic histories of these national reform processes have not adequately engaged with the skeletal evidence. The histories of English enclosure, of the French revolutionary land policies, of the Prussian agricultural reforms, have been written primarily by economic historians whose primary data sources were legal records, agricultural output statistics, wage data, and written accounts. The skeletal record was not part of their analytical toolkit, and the bioarchaeologists who compiled the skeletal data were, for most of the 20th century, working within a different academic discipline that did not routinely engage with the economic history literature. The two bodies of evidence developed in parallel, in separate academic conversations, without being systematically placed alongside each other. That separation is itself worth noting. Two bodies of evidence, one documenting the legal and economic transformation of land tenure across Western Europe, the other documenting the physical changes in the bodies of the people who lived through that transformation, developed across the same period in separate academic silos. The connection between them was not obvious, because nobody was institutionally positioned to look at both simultaneously. And the standard economic histories of agricultural reform, written without reference to the skeletal data, arrived at accounts that emphasized efficiency, productivity, and economic modernization, without incorporating the evidence that those same processes were producing measurable physical changes in the bodies of the laboring populations they most directly affected. The pattern across England, France, Prussia, and Scandinavia is now visible enough that researchers who encounter it find it difficult to set aside. Different political systems, different legal mechanisms, different stated motivations, the same structural outcome for common land access. And in each case, a skeletal record that shows laboring populations getting shorter during the same period that their access to the shared resources that had sustained their early childhood nutrition was contracting. Whether that consistency amounts to proof of causation remains a genuinely open question in the research literature. But it amounts to something that the standard historical account, as it has been written and repeated, has not yet fully absorbed or adequately explained. The skeletal record is compelling. It is precise, it is measurable, and it is difficult to argue with in the way that physical evidence generally is. But bones require excavation. They require laboratory analysis. They require the slow work of bioarchaeologists moving through storage collections and burial sites, compiling measurements that most people will never directly encounter. The evidence they produce is real and significant, but it sits at a distance from ordinary experience. Most people will never hold a medieval femur or examine a height reconstruction table from a university research study. The architectural evidence is different. It is still standing. It is visible. It can be walked through, measured, and experienced directly by anyone who visits the right buildings. And what it shows, when examined carefully rather than simply absorbed as atmosphere, is the same pattern that the skeletal data shows: a sustained, multi-century decline in the physical size of the people who built and used these structures. The buildings did not record this deliberately. Nobody was keeping an architectural log of population height, but the record was created anyway, because people build for themselves. They build for the bodies they have. And when those bodies change across generations, the buildings change with them. The specific finding that anchors this part of the investigation is measurable and documented. Doorways in English farmhouses constructed before 1400 are, on average, taller than doorways in English farmhouses built between 1600 and 1800. This is not a vague impression. It is a measurable difference, recorded by researchers who have systematically examined surviving rural structures from these different periods and compared their dimensions. The difference is consistent enough across enough examples to constitute a pattern rather than a collection of individual anomalies. At first, this seems counterintuitive, and that counterintuitive quality is worth pausing on, because it reveals something about the assumptions most people carry into historical thinking. The natural expectation is that later construction should reflect improvement. Later buildings should be larger, better made, more spacious. As technique improves, as materials become more accessible, as society develops, the built environment should expand rather than contract. A farmhouse built in 1700 should be more spacious than a farmhouse built in 1350, not less. That is what the standard narrative of historical progress would predict. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the farmhouses built between 1600 and 1800 were not being built by architects working from abstract specifications or by contractors serving wealthy clients with expanding ambitions. They were being built by the laboring families who would live in them. People built their own homes. They built to their own dimensions. They built door frames that fit the bodies passing through them, ceilings that corresponded to the heights of the people who would stand beneath them, rooms proportioned for the people who would occupy them. And by 1700, the people building those structures were, on measurable average, several inches shorter than the people who had built comparable structures 3 centuries earlier. The shorter doors were not a product of reduced skill or reduced resources in any simple sense. They were a product of reduced stature. The builders were shorter. They built shorter. The logic is direct once the assumption of continuous improvement is set aside and replaced with the actual historical data about what was happening to the bodies of laboring populations during these centuries. This reframing has significant implications for how these surviving structures should be understood. Low ceilings in older rural buildings are routinely described in historical literature and in heritage tourism as characteristic of their period. Quaint, atmospheric, charmingly primitive. The language used to describe them tends to place them in the category of limitation, of a simpler and less developed time, when construction was less sophisticated and spaces were accordingly more compressed. The low ceiling is framed as a product of what people did not yet know how to do, or did not yet have the resources to do. But there's a problem with that framing. It does not match the evidence. The buildings from the earlier period, the ones from before 1400, are not universally smaller than the buildings from the later period. The doorways are measurably taller. If low ceilings and narrow doorways were simply a product of limited construction knowledge or limited resources, the earlier buildings should be the smaller ones, because earlier construction was by definition less technically developed than later construction. The evidence runs in the opposite direction, and that reversal is what the standard framing cannot account for. The more accurate description of what these buildings represent is not limitation. It is calibration. A building is calibrated to the people who will use it. A door frame is set at a height that the people passing through it can manage comfortably. A ceiling is placed at a height that the people living beneath it can function under without constant physical difficulty. When the calibration shifts downward across a period of several centuries, it is not because the builders forgot how to build taller. It is because the people doing the building were shorter. The buildings are recording a biological reality. They are accidental data points in a dataset that nobody planned to create. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult in a specific way, because treating these buildings as data points rather than as aesthetic objects changes what questions can be asked of them. If a low doorway is simply charming, it invites admiration. If a low doorway is a measurement, it invites a different kind of question. Whose body does this reflect? When was this built? What was happening to the people who built it during the generations that preceded its construction? Those questions lead back to the skeletal record, and from the skeletal record back to the economic and legal history of the same period. The building becomes a node in a larger network of evidence, connected to the bones of the people who built it and to the historical forces that shaped the bodies those bones recorded. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the architectural record is not a small dataset. Surviving rural structures from the medieval and early modern periods exist across England in significant numbers. Many have been documented, measured, and catalogued. The doorway heights and ceiling heights of these structures constitute a physical archive that spans centuries and covers a substantial geographic area. When that archive is examined with the question of population height in mind, rather than with the question of architectural style or historical charm, it yields information that is consistent with the skeletal record in its general direction and its approximate timeline. The buildings built before the period of steepest height decline are taller in their proportions. The buildings built during and after the period of steepest decline are shorter. This is not a universal rule without exceptions. Building construction is influenced by many factors beyond the height of the builders, including the available materials, the local building traditions, the specific function of the structure, and the economic resources of the family commissioning it. These factors introduce variation that prevents the architectural record from functioning as a precise measuring instrument in the way that skeletal measurements do. But variation is not the same as absence of pattern, and the pattern, when examined across enough examples, is present and consistent in its direction. Some architectural historians have approached these buildings primarily as examples of vernacular building tradition, studying the techniques, the materials, and the regional variations in construction style. That work has produced valuable knowledge about how ordinary people built in different periods and different regions, but it has not, in most cases, been conducted with population height as a primary analytical lens. The question of what doorway heights and ceiling heights tell us about the bodies of the people who built them has been raised occasionally, but has not become a central question in vernacular architecture research. This is one of the gaps that exists between architectural history and bioarchaeology, two fields that are examining the same historical period from different angles without always reading each other's findings. When those findings are placed alongside each other, the convergence is notable. The skeletal data shows laboring populations getting shorter between roughly 1300 and 1800. The architectural data shows laboring family farmhouses getting proportionally smaller across the same general period. Two independent bodies of evidence, produced by researchers working from completely different source materials, pointing in the same direction across the same historical time frame. That convergence does not prove any particular causal account, but it does confirm that the height decline was real, that it was substantial, and that it left traces not only in the burial sites where the bones of these people were eventually placed, but in the structures those people built and lived in during their lifetimes. However, the timeline does not fully match with perfect precision across the architectural record. The shift in building proportions was gradual, as the height shift itself was gradual, and the architectural record is complicated by the fact that not all surviving buildings from a given period represent laboring family construction. Wealthier farmhouses from the same centuries tend to be larger and better preserved, which means they are overrepresented in the surviving architectural record relative to the smaller structures built by the poorest laboring families. This sampling bias means that the full extent of the size reduction in laboring family construction during the period of steepest height decline may not be fully visible in the buildings that have survived to be measured. The smallest and most compressed structures built by the most economically marginal families were also the most likely to have been demolished, modified, or simply lost over the subsequent centuries. This raises questions about what the current architectural record is actually showing, and whether the pattern would be even more pronounced if the full range of laboring family construction from these centuries had survived. There is no way to answer that question directly. The buildings that are gone cannot be measured. What can be said is that the surviving record, despite its sampling limitations, shows a consistent pattern that aligns with the skeletal data. And that consistency, across two independent bodies of evidence with different preservation biases, is itself methodologically meaningful. The tourism industry that now describes these structures as charming and atmospheric is not being dishonest. The buildings are old. They do have a particular quality that comes from age and handcraft and the specific materials of their period. But the description stops short of asking what that atmosphere actually represents. The low doorway that a modern visitor ducks through without thinking much about it was not designed to require ducking. It was designed to fit the person who would use it every day. The fact that it no longer fits a modern body is not a quaint detail. It is information. It is telling the observer something specific about the person who built it, about how tall that person was, about when that person lived, about what was happening to the population that person belonged to during the generations that shaped their body. Each doorway in each surviving farmhouse from this period is a measurement. It is not a precise one in the way that a skeletal reconstruction is precise, but it is a physical record of a body size, preserved in oak and limestone, still standing in the landscape, still available to be read by anyone who approaches it with the right question. The question is not why the door is so small. The question is what made the person who built it that height, and what the investigation has been tracing across bones and documents and parliamentary records and regional skeletal datasets from multiple countries is a set of answers to that question that the charming description on the heritage tourism placard does not begin to address. Any serious investigation eventually reaches the point where alternative explanations have to be considered directly, not dismissed, not minimized, considered, because the value of any argument depends partly on how honestly it engages with the strongest versions of the counterarguments available to it. And in the case of the connection between land access, nutritional status, and the multi-century height decline in Western European laboring populations, there are several alternative interpretations that have been put forward by serious researchers working from genuine evidence. Each of them deserves careful attention before any conclusions are drawn about what the overall pattern means. The first and perhaps most frequently cited alternative centers on disease. specifically on plague. The Black Death arrived in Western Europe in 1347 and killed a substantial proportion of the population within a few years. Estimates of mortality vary by region and continue to be debated, but the scale of the demographic catastrophe was genuinely without precedent in the recorded history of the continent. And plague did not arrive once and then disappear. It returned repeatedly across the following centuries, hitting different regions at different times with varying intensity, creating a sustained pattern of epidemic disruption that lasted well into the 17th century in some parts of Europe. The argument that disease was the primary driver of the height decline, rather than land access, rests on a straightforward biological logic. Repeated epidemic illness during childhood places enormous metabolic stress on developing bodies. A child fighting a serious infection is diverting energy and nutritional resources toward immune response rather than toward growth. If that pattern of infection is repeated across the critical early developmental window, the cumulative effect on skeletal growth can be substantial. And plague, combined with the other infectious diseases that circulated through medieval and early modern populations, created exactly the kind of chronic disease burden that this argument requires. This is a legitimate position. The biology behind it is sound. Disease does affect height. The plague epidemics were real, and their demographic effects were severe. Researchers who emphasize disease as a primary factor are not working from weak evidence. They are working from documented historical events with known biological consequences. The question is not whether disease played a role. It clearly did. The question is whether disease alone, or even disease as the primary factor, fully accounts for the pattern observed in the skeletal record. But this is where it becomes unclear. Because the height decline predates the arrival of the Black Death in 1347. The skeletal data shows the downward trend beginning in the 13th century, before plague had arrived in Western Europe, which means that whatever initiated the decline was already operating before the disease argument can apply. Plague may have deepened or accelerated a decline that was already underway, but it cannot account for the beginning of that decline. And the beginning matters, because it points toward causes that were active before 1347, during a period when the most significant changes in the landscape were not epidemiological, but legal and economic. The pressure on common land was already building in the 13th century. The plague arrived later. The timeline does not fully match the disease primary argument. Climate is the second major alternative explanation. The Little Ice Age, a period of sustained cooling that affected much of the northern hemisphere roughly between the 14th and 19th centuries, reduced agricultural yields in ways that were not evenly distributed across the period or across regions. Cold summers shortened growing seasons. Harvest failures became more frequent. The agricultural surplus that in better climatic conditions might have provided a buffer against nutritional stress was more difficult to maintain. The argument is that this sustained climatic pressure reduced food availability for ordinary people in ways that affected their nutritional status and consequently their height, independently of any changes in land tenure. Again, this is a legitimate position with real evidence behind it. Climate does affect agricultural output. The Little Ice Age was real, and its effects on European harvests are documented in both historical records and in proxy climate data from tree rings, ice cores, and other sources. Researchers who emphasize climate as a significant factor in the height decline are not speculating. They are connecting a documented environmental shift to a documented biological outcome through a plausible causal chain. However, the timeline creates the same problem here as it does for the disease argument. The Little Ice Age began, in its most commonly cited periodization, around the middle of the 14th century. The height decline in laboring populations begins in the skeletal record before that, and the climate argument faces an additional difficulty. The height decline was not evenly distributed across populations in the same climate. Wealthy populations living through the same cold centuries, subject to the same reduced harvests, did not show the same height reduction as laboring populations. If climate were the primary driver, the effect should be visible across social classes. It is not. It is concentrated in the laboring population, which means the explanation has to account for why the same climate affected wealthy bodies and poor bodies so differently. And that differential, once again, points towards something specific to the material circumstances of laboring families, rather than to an environmental factor that affected everyone equally. Some historians have raised a different kind of objection, one that is less about the cause of the height decline and more about the interpretation of enclosure itself. The argument here is that enclosure has been politically overloaded in certain strands of historical writing, that it has been treated as a single coherent process with uniform effects, when it was actually a highly varied set of local processes with outcomes that differed significantly by region, by period, by the specific terms of individual enclosure agreements, and by the local economic conditions that shaped how those agreements were implemented and experienced. The broad narrative of enclosure as a continent-wide catastrophe for laboring families, this argument suggests, oversimplifies what was genuinely a complex and locally specific history. This caution is legitimate and worth taking seriously. Enclosure was not a single event. It was not a uniform policy applied consistently across a defined period. It varied enormously in its pace, its legal mechanisms, its geographic scope, and its practical effects on the families it affected. In some regions and some periods, the compensation offered was more adequate. In some cases, families retained access to resources that technically fell outside the legal definition of common rights, but functioned similarly in practice. The history is genuinely complicated, and researchers who treat it as simpler than it was are producing accounts that do not fully reflect the available evidence. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult to sustain as a full counter-argument. Acknowledging that enclosure was locally variable is not the same as arguing that its aggregate effect on common land access was negligible or that its nutritional consequences for laboring populations were minor. The legal and historical record shows that common land in England was reduced to approximately 3% of its 1,500 extent by 1850. That is an aggregate fact that survives the acknowledgement of local variation. The variation was in the process. The outcome, at the aggregate level, was consistent in its direction, and the height data, which also shows local and regional variation, shows a consistent directional pattern at the aggregate level that aligns with that outcome. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the critics of the enclosure narrative and the researchers who emphasize the land access connection are not actually disagreeing about the facts of what happened to common land. They are disagreeing about how much weight to assign to that process relative to other factors in explaining the height decline. That is a genuine methodological debate, and it has not been definitively resolved. But it is a debate about emphasis and causation, not a debate about whether the pattern in the skeletal record is real or whether common land contracted during the relevant period. Both sides of that debate accept those basic facts. The third and perhaps most structurally significant observation raised in this context concerns not the evidence itself, but the conditions under which the historical knowledge about this period was produced. The canonical narratives of agricultural development in Western Europe were established primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The scholars who wrote those narratives worked within specific institutional contexts. They worked at universities and research institutions that were funded, directly or indirectly, by the accumulated wealth of the period they were studying. The families whose endowments supported those institutions, whose names appeared on library buildings and fellowship funds, were in many cases descended from exactly the class of landowners who had benefited most directly from the enclosure processes those scholars were analyzing. This is not an accusation of deliberate dishonesty. That point deserves emphasis because it is easily misread. The claim being made here is not that those scholars were paid to produce favorable accounts of enclosure, or that they consciously suppressed evidence of its nutritional consequences. The claim is more subtle and more structural than that. It is about what questions were asked and what questions were not asked, about what evidence was treated as central and what evidence was treated as peripheral, about whose experience of the historical process under study was visible in the sources those scholars primarily worked with, and whose experience was not. The experience of laboring families during the enclosure period is not well documented in the written sources that 19th century economic historians primarily used. Parliamentary records document the legal process. Agricultural surveys document productivity and output. Estate records document the economic activities of landowners. The daily nutritional reality of a laboring family that had lost its grazing rights, the disappearance of the household pig, the shift from eating chickens to selling them. These things were not systematically recorded in the documents that historians train to use. They are recorded, partially and indirectly, in the skeletal remains of the people who experienced them. But skeletal analysis as a historical tool did not exist in the 19th century in the form that it exists today. So the scholars who established the canonical narratives were not ignoring available evidence. They were working with the evidence that their methods and their training allowed them to access. The bioarchaeological evidence that most directly shows the nutritional consequences of enclosure for laboring populations was not available to them in any usable form. What they had was the legal record, the agricultural productivity data, and the economic theory of their time. From those sources, they produced accounts that emphasized efficiency, productivity, and the economic logic of agricultural modernization. Those accounts were not fabricated. They reflected what the available sources showed. They simply did not include the evidence that was sitting in the ground, unmeasured and unanalyzed, waiting for a methodology that would not exist for another century. The observation that those historians worked within institutions shaped by the class that benefited from enclosure is relevant not because it implies corruption, but because it helps explain why certain questions were not asked. The question of what enclosure did to the bodies of laboring families was not the kind of question that the institutional and intellectual environment of 19th century economic history was organized to ask. It required a different kind of evidence, a different disciplinary framework, and a different starting assumption about whose physical experience of a historical process was worth measuring and recording. Some believe this structural observation explains the gap between what the skeletal evidence shows and what the standard historical accounts emphasize. Others disagree, arguing that the gap is better explained by the genuine methodological limitations of the period rather than by any structural bias in how questions were selected. That disagreement has not been resolved. It may not be resolvable in any final sense, because it concerns not just the historical evidence, but the conditions under which historical knowledge is produced, which is itself a contested and genuinely complex question. What can be said is that the alternative explanations, disease, climate, the complexity of enclosure as a local process, each capture something real. None of them fully accounts for the pattern in the skeletal record on its own. And the structural observation about who produced the canonical historical accounts does not prove any particular causal argument. It raises a question about emphasis, about what was considered important enough to examine closely and what was not. And that question, like the pattern in the bones themselves, remains more open than the standard historical account has typically acknowledged. At some point in the late 19th century, the long decline reversed. It did not reverse suddenly. It did not reverse uniformly across all regions or all populations at the same moment, but the direction changed. The skeletal data and the military recruitment records and the public health measurements that began to be systematically collected during this period all show the same thing. Average heights in Western European and American populations began to rise, slowly at first, then more noticeably across the early decades of the 20th century. Then sharply through the middle decades of that century, during a period of sustained height increase that brought populations back toward figures that had not been recorded since the early medieval period. The average Western European male today stands at approximately 5 feet 10 inches. In some Northern European populations, the current average slightly exceeds that figure. This means that after roughly 5 to 6 centuries of decline and approximately a century of recovery, the average height of Western European men has returned to close to where it was in the early centuries of the first millennium. The curve that dropped so steadily for so long has climbed back. The question of what drove that recovery is not a minor footnote to the story of the decline. It is, in some respects, the most revealing part of the entire pattern, because what caused the recovery points directly back toward what caused the decline. The standard explanation for the height recovery credits industrial progress and rising wages. The argument runs like this. As industrial economies matured, wages for ordinary workers increased. Higher wages meant better purchasing power. Better purchasing power meant better food. Better food meant taller children. And the general improvement in living standards associated with economic development produced, over time, a population that was better nourished, better sheltered, and consequently taller than the populations of the preceding centuries. This explanation is not wrong. Rising wages did contribute to improved nutrition for many working families during this period. The relationship between economic development and population health is real and documented. But there is a problem. The explanation is incomplete in ways that matter significantly for understanding the full picture. Researchers who have examined the specific inputs that drove height recovery have found that the credit cannot be assigned simply and broadly to industrial wages and economic growth. The recovery was not uniform across populations that were experiencing similar levels of wage growth. It was concentrated in periods and places where specific interventions occurred, and those interventions were not primarily economic in the market sense. They were structural. They involved the deliberate provision, through collective and state mechanisms, of the specific resources that determine height in early childhood: protein, freedom from chronic infectious disease, reliable access to adequate caloric intake during the developmental window that matters most. The expansion of municipal sanitation systems in the second half of the 19th century was one of the earliest and most significant drivers of height recovery. Clean water and effective sewage removal reduced the burden of waterborne infectious disease that had placed enormous metabolic stress on developing children for centuries. A child who is not spending the first years of life fighting repeated gastrointestinal infections grows more efficiently on the same nutritional intake than a child who is. The disease reduction that came with organized sanitation did not require higher wages. It required collective infrastructure, funded and maintained through public systems that reached all residents of a given area regardless of their individual economic position. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Because public sanitation is not a market mechanism, it is a collective one. It is infrastructure provided to a population, not through their individual purchasing power, but through shared systems that give everyone within their reach access to a baseline level of environmental health. In that structural sense, it functions similarly to the commons. Not identically. The commons was a legal right attached to specific land, providing specific resources to specific families. Municipal sanitation is a technical system providing environmental health to an entire urban population. The mechanisms are completely different, but the underlying logic has something in common. It is the provision of a shared resource that establishes a baseline below which the most economically vulnerable members of the population cannot fall, regardless of their individual circumstances. Public health programs that followed in the early 20th century extended this logic further. Vaccination programs reduced childhood mortality from diseases that had previously placed chronic stress on developing bodies, even when they did not kill. School meal programs in Britain and elsewhere provided reliable nutritional intake to children from the poorest families during the school day, directly targeting the early childhood developmental window where nutritional adequacy matters most for skeletal growth. Food welfare programs established minimum nutritional floors that the market alone had not provided. Each of these interventions was collective in its structure. Each was designed to reach the children who were most at risk of nutritional inadequacy, the children whose family circumstances would otherwise leave them below the threshold of adequate early development. This is where the explanation becomes difficult for the standard narrative of industrial progress and rising wages. Because if rising wages alone were sufficient to explain the height recovery, then the recovery should have proceeded roughly in proportion to wage growth, and it should have been concentrated among the families that experienced the greatest wage increases. But that is not quite what the evidence shows. The height recovery was significantly accelerated by the specific collective interventions described above. Populations that received public sanitation earlier showed earlier height increases. Populations that received school meal programs showed accelerated recovery among the children they reached. The interventions were not simply following a recovery that wages had already initiated. They were driving a recovery that wages alone were not producing quickly enough or completely enough to account for the observed pattern. Some researchers have described this in structural terms that are worth examining directly, even if the framing is debated. The height recovery in this reading was produced in significant part by the partial reconstruction through state and collective mechanisms, of the nutritional baseline that had been lost when the original commons were enclosed. The commons had provided laboring families with direct access to protein through household livestock kept on common land, with environmental resources through common wood, water, and grazing rights, and with a degree of economic resilience through the variety of resources those rights represented. When the commons were enclosed, those provisions disappeared. When public sanitation, public health programs, and food welfare arrived in the late 19th and 20th centuries, they restored some functional equivalent of that baseline, not through land rights, but through state-mediated collective provision. Whether that parallel is meaningful or coincidental is genuinely debated among researchers. Some find the structural similarity compelling. They argue that it is not accidental that the specific interventions which drove height recovery were precisely those that restored the inputs that the loss of the commons had removed. Protein access through food programs, disease reduction through collective sanitation, economic floor through welfare systems. The correspondence between what was lost and what was eventually replaced is, in this view, too precise to be treated as coincidental. Others are more cautious, arguing that the parallel is an interesting observation, but that the mechanisms are different enough that drawing a structural equivalence between medieval common rights and modern welfare states risks oversimplifying both. That debate has not reached a settled conclusion. However, the timeline does not fully match the simplest version of the recovery story either. The height increase accelerated most sharply in the mid-20th century, during and after the period when the most comprehensive welfare state programs were established across Western Europe. Britain's National Health Service, established in 1948, provided universal healthcare access regardless of individual economic position. Food rationing during and immediately after the Second World War, despite its association with scarcity, actually improved the nutritional adequacy of the poorest segments of the British population by ensuring that protein and essential nutrients were distributed more evenly than the market had distributed them before the war. These are counterintuitive findings that sit uncomfortably within the standard narrative of recovery through economic growth, but they appear consistently in the research that has examined the specific drivers of height increase in the 20th century. This raises questions that the standard explanation does not fully engage with. If the height recovery was primarily a product of economic growth and rising wages, why did the recovery accelerate most sharply during the mid-20th century when collective provision was expanding most rapidly, rather than during the earlier decades of rapid industrial wage growth? Why did populations in countries with more comprehensive welfare programs show steeper height increases than populations in countries where market mechanisms remained the primary distributor of nutritional resources? These questions do not have simple answers, but they point consistently toward collective provision rather than market wages as the more important driver of the specific inputs that determine height. The doorway in Burgundy is still standing. It is still 4 feet 11 inches tall. The measurement has not changed. The farmhouse has not been modified to accommodate modern bodies. It sits in the French countryside as it has sat since 1423, a physical record of a specific moment in the long history of what was happening to the bodies of ordinary people in Western Europe. Visitors still pass through it. Some of them duck instinctively. Some of them pause and wonder briefly about the people who built it. Most of them move on. The skeletal record is still in the archives. The bones from the early medieval period still show men averaging close to 5 feet 8 inches. The bones from the 17th and 18th centuries still show the laboring population several inches shorter. The gap between those two sets of measurements is still there, still waiting for an explanation that fully accounts for its shape, its timing, its social distribution, and its eventual reversal. The standard narrative has not yet provided that explanation in a form that engages honestly with all of the evidence. The alternative accounts that emphasize disease, climate, and the complexity of enclosure as a local process each capture something real without fully closing the question. What remains is the pattern itself, a population that was reasonably tall in the early centuries of the first millennium, a sustained, multi-century decline that was steepest among the poor and shallower among the wealthy, a low point reached during the period of peak industrial expansion, a recovery driven significantly by collective provision of the specific inputs that the decline had removed, and a return, after 6 centuries, to roughly the heights where the record began. That pattern is written in bones, in door frames, in parliamentary records, in burial sites across multiple countries, in the measured dimensions of surviving farmhouses, and in the research literature of 2 academic disciplines that spent most of the 20th century not reading each other. The buildings described as charming in the heritage literature are still being photographed. The low ceilings are still being called atmospheric. The narrow staircases are still being described as characteristic of the period. And all of those descriptions are accurate in the narrow sense that the buildings do have those qualities, and they are from that period. What the descriptions do not convey is what those qualities represent, what they record about the bodies of the people who built them, what those bodies record about the conditions those people were living under, and what those conditions record about the legal and economic processes that shaped them across several centuries. Whether what happened to those bodies was the inevitable and unfortunate consequence of historical forces too complex to assign responsibility to, or whether it reflects something more specific about decisions made and rights removed and resources transferred from the many to the few, is a question the evidence raises without settling. Some believe the pattern is clear enough to support a stronger conclusion. Others maintain that the complexity of the historical record resists any single interpretive frame. Both positions are held by serious researchers working from genuine evidence. What can be said with confidence is that the investigation this evidence opens is not complete. The doorway in Burgundy holds a measurement. The bones in the archives hold a record. The parliamentary documents hold a legal history. And the question of how those 3 things are connected, what they collectively mean for how this period of history is understood and taught, remains more open than the standard account has typically acknowledged. The ceilings were built for the people who were there, and the question of what made those people that height is one that the evidence asks clearly, persistently, and without yet receiving a fully satisfying answer.